I want to talk for a second about imagery in poetry. Now, that is a giant subject, imagery, because there's so much imagery in so many poems, and imagery isn't even narrowly defined when we're discussing poetry as it might be outside of poetry. For example, outside, when somebody says, what's an image of something, they're almost always talking about a visual representation in a way, right? Well, in poetry and literature, we don't stop there. If something appeals to the sense of sound, for example, we still call it an image. The sense of taste could also be, but obviously some through history have dominated, and the visual is the most obvious one, right? But if you can expand when you're writing your poetry to think of images beyond the visual, and I do really tell people who are trying to get going in poetry that imagery would be one of the very best things to think about. But my advice wouldn't really just be you should only be thinking about imagery. It's just the idea that so often people start writing poems and their their mind is to some degree a bit captive by some idea like end rhyme, and they're trying to figure out phrases that land on a word that rhymes with the line before or two lines before, or sometimes sound, and they specifically are emphasizing the different kinds of sounds the different letters make in our alphabet and our words, and all of those things are fine. I would say that one of the best things would be to write some poems where you're thinking specifically about images, right? Then write a poem where you're specifically thinking about something like action, right? Write a poem where you're specifically thinking about an idea that drives the poem, such as a memory poem or a puzzle poem or something, right? And over time, you learn to feel them, not just to know them, intellectually, but you learn to feel these things. And eventually, of course, what happens is they might work together. You might write a narrative poem where your visual description is really important in it, right? But in the narrative also, there might be some action in there that's very important. So I just think imagery is a great place to start compared to what so many people do. And number one, I think they worry about rhyme, and number two, they worry about real life, like something that happened in real life. They start to tell the story, and they're so strapped into the story that they're often not even using poetic language at all, right? So imagery is a great place to start. Now, a great example of this is Billy Collins's poem Introduction to Poetry. Now, if you go to the website Poetry 180, you'll find this as the number one poem on that list, partially because he's the one, when he was poet laureate, who's helped set up the project Poetry 180. But I'm going to read it in just a second, and you'll see that it's a great introduction to people who are maybe starting to study poetry, or they're going beyond what they've done before. And he's reminding us not to be too academic, not to be too new critical and just look for the, like it's a treasure hunt where you're trying to find the most metaphors and similes or something like that. He's reminding us also that the surface of a poem is important, because so many analytical people and teachers sort of throw away the surface and just go for quote unquote what the poem really means, right? Which is death to a lot of experiences with poetry. Okay, so let me read it, and I'll mention a couple of these things, right? Introduction to Poetry. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. So can you see each one of the stanzas has at least one image, right? So the first stanza is from photography, before digital photography, where we took pictures with slides, and they were very tiny, so you had to hold them up to the light so they'd be illuminated, and often we use a magnifier at the same time, right? So it's very visual. The second stanza is obviously about sound, and you can imagine maybe if you press your ear against the hive, hearing the buzzing and the sounds of the bees inside. The next stanza says drop a mouse into a poem. So first we see the mouse probably in our mind, but then it gets action, and watch him probe his way out. So we imagine the mouse maybe in a maze, right? Or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. Now that's what he wants the poets to do, not the mouse, right? But I love this image where you go into something that's dark, but you're not panicking. You're doing what you've done many times before. You're moving your hand at a level that makes sense, where a light switch might actually be, and you find it. And of course, finding a light switch lets you see so many other things. That's the metaphor, right? And a lot of poems seem so dark at first that it takes a little bit of confidence and calm. The next one is about water skiing, and you see the water skier right on the surface. And I think the water skier is a great image because it's an image of fun and recreation, and it's emphasizing this idea that poetry isn't just to be studied, right? The next stanza, but all they want to do is tie the poem to shit. Now, who is they? And the classic interpretation of the poem is its students, maybe professors too, right? The people that want to, not enjoy the poem, not see the different levels, but just get to some sort of maybe coded or encoded place where a secondary and tertiary meanings come out. The end of it is very condemnatory in a way. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. And you have to feel for the poem here. Maybe the poet too is that these analyzers, these professors of new criticism who, get in there just to find the literary devices and the elements of figurative language. By the time they do that, maybe they've beaten up a lot of what the poem could have offered in the first place, right? Okay, that was Billy Collins's Introduction to Poetry.